Excuse me, where do I sit?
You can sit on this chair in front of me. I want you to introduce your name and explain your experience on that day.
Hi, my name is Velvet. So, the dinner guests started arriving at about 7:30. That evening, Reverend Truelove, the neighbors, old Mr. Archibald and his son, and Dame Christie, a lady novelist, were joining the weekend guests. I served drinks in the parlor before dinner. From the start, I could see things weren't going too well. Miss Daphne looked as if she had been crying, and after she had spoken a few words to young Mr. Archibald in the hall, that young gentleman looked pretty unhappy too. Mr. Jeffrey looked extremely angry. He can look quite violent at times. The actress, Miss Topless, looked furious too, and I could see why. Her companion, Mr. Oscarson, had been flirting with Mrs. Horsehair all weekend, and as I served the wine at dinner, I noticed that they were having a particularly intimate conversation at one end of the table. Dinner ended at about 9 o'clock, and I served port to the gentleman in the billiard room. As I left the kitchen, Miss Daphne came up to me and looking appealingly at me, she always looks so pretty in blue, pressed a note into my hand, asking me to give it to young Archibald. I served port in the billiard room and passed the note surreptitiously to young Mr. Archibald. Then I went back to the kitchen where I remained until shortly after 9:30, when I went back to the billiard room to refill the port glasses. As I was crossing the hall, Miss Topless came out of the parlor and went over to the ballroom. As she opened the door, I heard voices and caught a glimpse of a young man in a white suit. I'm sure it was Mr. Oscarson. I went into the billiard room to find only Mr. Archibald, Reverend Truelove, and Mr. Jeffrey. Mr. Archibald took a glass of port and said he would join the ladies in the parlor, and the Reverend followed him. Mr. Jeffrey took the port decanter from me and went into the library, saying he had an urgent letter to write. I returned to the kitchen and stayed there till about 10 o'clock when I heard a piercing scream. I rushed into the hall and found Charlotte, the maid, standing there with a tray of coffee cups. She muttered out the library before she fainted. I went into the library and found Mrs. Horsehair dead on the floor. She had been hit on the head. I looked around everywhere. The ashtray was full of cigarette stubs, the kind that Mr. Jeffrey smokes. I also noticed immediately that one of the large silver candlesticks was missing. Both the library window and the connecting door to the billiard room were open. I called for help, and Miss Daphne and young Mr. Archibald came running in from the conservatory. Dame Christie and Myrtle Berry were next on the scene, followed by old Mr. Archibald. Mr. Oscarson came in via the billiard room, followed a few seconds later by his actress friend, and last of all Mr. Jeffrey came rushing in, calling for help and shouting that he had found the vicar unconscious on the terrace.
I'm Charlotte. I'm working in the household as a maid.
So, can you tell me what happened on that night?
Around 7 o'clock, I went upstairs to put on my new uniform. Reverend Truelove, old Mr. Archibald and his son, and a famous lady novelist were joining the weekend guests for dinner. As I got to the top of the stairs, I heard angry voices coming from Mrs. Horsehair's room. I guess that Mrs. Horsehair and her niece were having one of their rows. I tried not to listen, but I couldn't help catching one phrase very distinctly. Then the door burst open, and Miss Daphne rushed out sobbing. She ran straight to her room and slammed the door. About 15 minutes later, I came downstairs again and heard Mr. Jeffrey talking on the telephone in the hall. I promise I tried not to listen, but I couldn't help overhearing one or two phrases. I guessed he was talking to one of his gambling companions. Mr. Jeffrey is very fond of gambling, but his mother disapproves and tries to prevent him from gambling by keeping him short of money. From 7:15 till 8 o'clock, I was in the kitchen preparing for the food, but I peeped out to watch the guests arrive. A person really stood out. It was young Mr. Archibald. He looked very dashing in blue velvet suit.
Can you tell me more about the dinner?
The dinner was at 8, and as soon as I came in with the soup, I noticed that things weren't going too well. Dame Christie and Martleberry seemed to be getting on quite well, discussing some murder, but Mr. Jeffrey looked like thunder, and young Mr. Archibald looked terribly unhappy. He's passionately in love with Miss Daphne, Daphne looked as if she were about to cry, and the actress Miss Topless looked a bit annoyed as well. This might have been because she and Miss Daphne were wearing exactly the same dress, or it might have been because her companion, Mr. Oscarson, were having a very intimate conversation with Mrs. Horsehair at the end of the table. Reverend Truelove and old Mr. Archibald tried to keep the conversation going, but it was quite a relief when dinner broke up at about 9 o'clock. The ladies then retired to the parlor for coffee, and the gentlemen went to the billiard room. I served coffee and then went back to the kitchen to clear up. At about 9:45, I went into the parlor to collect the coffee cups, and as I crossed the hall, I overheard loud voices in the ballroom. It sounded very much like Miss Topless. Suddenly, the door opened and Mrs. Horsehair came out. She asked me about her book, but I said that I hadn't seen it, and she muttered something about looking it in the library and made off that direction.
Was there anyone in the parlor? And what did they do?
As I went on into the parlor, where I found Dame Christie, Martleberry, and old Mr. Archibald still deep in conversation. They were still talking about murder. I couldn't help listening. It made me feel quite cold. So I collected up the coffee as slowly as I could. As I was doing this, I heard a door slammed in the hall, followed by the sound of footsteps crossing the hall. Then the front door slammed. I finished collecting the cups and went out into the hall, but no one was there. I started to cross the hall towards the kitchen, and suddenly I heard a piercing scream. It came from the library. I couldn't move. I tried to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. The kitchen door opened and Velvet came running out. She looked at me in astonishment. I could only mutter out the library, and then I blacked out.
Before we start, can you please introduce yourself, sir?
My name is Reverend Truelove, and I am the vicar for the local church.
Can you tell me what happened on that day?
On that day, I arrived at Conquest for Sunday tea as usual and was invited to return for dinner after evensong. Before I left, Mistress Horsehair asked me to advise her on a certain problem, and we went into the library to discuss it. Mistress Horsehair then confided me that she and the young film director Oscarson, who was one of her weekend guests, were planning to marry. I expressed my approval of the project, congratulated her, and then inquired what the problem might be. She was worried, it appeared, about how the marriage might affect her son Jeffrey. She thought he might disapprove of her remarrying so soon. and furthermore might object to her altering her will in favor of her new husband. I advised her to put her own interests first. She appeared satisfied with this, and I left the house. I returned at about 7:30 of the evensong and was shown into the parlor by Velvet the butler. I was immediately conscious of a rather strained atmosphere, particularly among the young people. Daphne and Archibald looked very unhappy, although I put this down to a lover's death, and Geoffrey's face looked like a thunderclap. I wondered if his mother had broached the subject of a marriage. The older members of the party, however, a lady novelist and an American friend of Mistress Horsehair's, seemed pleasant enough. Although there was also an actress who I found distinctly unpleasant. However, I endeavored to put them all at ease with one or two of my anecdotes in the usual style, and dinner passed quite pleasantly.
Where did you go after dinner?
After dinner, we gentlemen retired to the billiard room for port and a game of snooker. The first game ended just before 9:30, and both Oscar and young Archibald excused themselves, saying they had urgent matters to attend to. The rest of us stood around, talking until Velvet reappeared with the port. At that point, our little party dispersed. Geoffrey went to the library to finish off a letter, while old Archibald and I went to join the ladies in the parlor. I found the subject of conversation there rather distasteful, so after about 10 minutes, I went for a quiet stroll and a smoke in the grounds. I had been there for about a quarter of an hour, enjoying the evening air and mentally composing next Sunday's sermon, when Geoffrey came out of the house, slamming the front door behind him. He had taken off his formal dinner jacket and was wearing a dark blue smoking jacket. I invited him to join me, but he only grunted and strode off into the shrubbery. I finished my pipe, and hearing the church clock chime 10, I decided to go back into the house to take my leave. As I was crossing the terrace, I became aware that someone was behind me. I started to turn, and out of the corner of my eye caught a flash of something blue, but before I could make out who it was, a hand was pressed over my mouth, and I felt someone strike me with a heavy object from behind. Everything went black, and I fell to the ground.